Hi, this is Elliot from EO Nutrition, and today's video is going to be a short one, and we're going to look at one of the commonly used herbicides called glyphosate, otherwise known as Roundup, and whether this can contribute towards endogenous oxalate problems. So here's just a brief overview of what glyphosate is for those of you who aren't already aware, and an in-depth look at this is way beyond the scope of this video. We're just going to go over the basics. So glyphosate is most well known as Roundup, produced by the biotech company Monsanto. Its chemical name is N-phosphomethylglycine, and it's actually the most widespread herbicide used globally. So it's used in most countries around the world, and it's used predominantly on genetically modified corn, soy, wheat, cotton, canola, sugarcane, tobacco, and many other genetically modified plants. But what some people don't know is that glyphosate is also used as a desiccant. So it's used to essentially dry out crops before they are harvested. So even if it's not used as a herbicide per se, they do spray it on a variety of crops just before they're going to harvest them. And there's just a wide variety of these crops. So you have many of the grains, including rice, oats, and wheat. We have flax and cotton, but there's also many of the legumes. So we have things like chickpeas and lentils and other kinds of beans. You have soybeans and peas, maize, mustard, but there's also many of the seeds as well. So any of the seeds which are used for oil, typically things like rapeseed and sunflower seed and all of these kinds of things. Some of the vegetables like potatoes, and the data that's come out over the past couple of decades is really quite disturbing. Turns out that the glyphosate residues are found in many of the foods which people consume on a regular basis. So there's a body called the Alliance for Natural Health in the USA, and in their testing they found that glyphosate was found in many of the grain-based products like bread and breakfast cereals, but it also got into eggs, and this was including the organic free-range eggs and some of the other organic products. In 10 out of 14 oat-based cereals, glyphosate was found, and in 59% of 69 honeys which were tested, they also had residues of glyphosate. And now this actually also included the organic varieties. In the UK, glyphosate has been found on strawberries, lettuce, carrots, potatoes, lentils, pulses, other grain-based products, and cereals. Between 2000 and 2013, there were 2,951 bread samples which were tested, and out of all of the pesticide residues, the most frequently found was glyphosate. So glyphosate is making its way into the food supply through many different avenues. And even more concerning is that glyphosate, which is being sprayed on grains, when animals are fed conventional grains as their feed, it turns out that the animals seem to accumulate this as well. So in a study of 30 dairy cows from 8 different Danish farms, glyphosate was found in the urine of all of them. Interestingly, this same study showed very low levels of manganese. We know that glyphosate is a very potent chelator of manganese, and this is potentially one of the reasons why. There was another study which compared German and Danish cows, and this was basically looking at the level of glyphosate in conventional versus GMO-free cows. So basically cows which have been fed conventional feed versus GMO feed. And the GMO-free cows had significantly less glyphosate. Glyphosate is being found actually in the organs of the cows as well. So it is being found in the cow intestine, in the liver, in the muscles, spleen, lung, and the kidney. Likewise, in commercial broiler chickens as well, it's been found in the organs. So what it seems like is that when these animals, the animals that we feed conventional grain which has been sprayed with glyphosate, it seems that these cows or these animals actually accumulate this. They store this in their bodies, and this is a major concern. And to make matters worse, in humans, this also seems to be a problem. So there was a study by a German group which found that glyphosate was in 99.6% of the 2009 people who they studied. So that is the very, very, very large majority. Almost all of them were excreting glyphosate in the urine. Now, even more concerning is that the highest levels were in children aged 0 to 9 and adolescents between the age of 10 and 19 years old. They found the highest levels of people who were raised on farms, which is expected because if you live on a farm where you are spraying glyphosate, it's in the air, it's likely in the water, and it's in the food supply, then you are going to be getting a much higher level than other people. Now, not surprisingly, meat eaters had the highest level of glyphosate contamination when compared to vegetarians or vegans. Now, this is not to say that a vegetarian or vegan diet is the way or is the solution here. But essentially what we have to understand is that this toxin does accumulate. And if animals, for instance, are consuming a bunch of this throughout their lifetime, they are going to accumulate that. And if they cannot get rid of that, then it makes sense that their tissues are going to have very high levels in. And when we consume that, when we consume the meat, such as supermarket, conventionally grain-fed meat, then it's understandable why we would have higher levels than someone who didn't consume that. In 2016, 48 MEPs based throughout the European Union, they all were found to have glyphosate in their urine. There was another study which actually showed that people who had established, diagnosed chronic health conditions also had higher levels than healthy subjects. And interestingly enough, there was another study which showed that people who ate an organic diet had much lower levels than people who had conventional diets, which is not surprising. As I said, going through all of the details with regard to the toxicity of glyphosate is way beyond the scope of this video. And in fact, people have done that very well in the past. So I would recommend, if you like to look at some of the research I've spoken about, if you like a more in-depth look at all of this, then you can go to this document. It was published in 2016. It's called the Glyphosate Monograph. Just type that into Google and it will send you, or it will bring you to a free PDF which you can download and have a read about. But now onto the topic of today's video. Before we look at how glyphosate may have a relation to oxalate, we have to look at how glyphosate is degraded. So as the tests show, animals can store glyphosate, animals urinate glyphosate out. Human beings also urinate unmetabolized glyphosate, but it turns out glyphosate can be degraded. The primary degradation is actually by microbes. So glyphosate is catabolized into two main byproducts. One is called aminomethylphosphonic acid, abbreviated as AMPA, and the other one is called glyoxylate. Now, there are a couple of enzymes which can do this. One is called glyphosate oxidoreductase, and another one is called glycine oxidase. So the bacteria can take glyphosate and break it down into these two different things. And there are several bugs which have been shown to do this quite well. So some of them are based in the soil. They are spore-based probiotics, they're called. Others can be found in certain types of foods. Others occupy the human gut. For instance, we have Acetobacter, which is an interesting one that is found in sauerkraut juice in quite high levels, or in vinegar. We also have Bacillus subtilis, Bacillus coagulans. These are spore-based probiotics. These are available on the market through a couple of different companies at the moment, and there are several other probiotics, as we call them, which have actually been shown to initiate this reaction whereby we're taking glyphosate and we are breaking them down. And so in this context, probiotics and other microorganisms are extremely beneficial in our protection against glyphosate. So the question is, what happens inside the human body? Well, we know that glyphosate, when we take glyphosate into the gut, when we are consuming it, it has a very interesting effect on our gut bacteria. So it inhibits, in plants and bacteria, it inhibits an enzyme called EPSP synthase, and this is involved in something called the shipmate pathway. And this is how bacteria are basically producing aromatic amino acids such as phenylalanine, tyrosine, tryptophan. This is the way that it works. It's targeting this enzyme, and this is one of the ways that it renders plants and bacteria dysfunctional. But what we see is in the gut bacteria, there is a preferential growth of certain bacteria, potential pathogens, Clostridia, Salmonella, and we also see other known beneficial flora, like such as Lactobacillus. These are really quite sensitive to glyphosate, and so glyphosate intake can cause a kind of dysbiosis or an imbalance in the gut flora. The work of Dr. Stephanie Seneff has shown that glyphosate can quite well disrupt the metabolism of sulfur compounds in our body and render the human body somewhat sulfate deficient. And what's interesting enough is that when we are measuring urine or hair, you can see that glyphosate and its byproduct AMPA can be excreted by the human body. This suggests that when we intake glyphosate, our gut bacteria is having an effect on that and potentially breaking that down in some cases. However, it's previously been thought that the human body does not, through its own enzymes, through its own kind of biochemistry, that we cannot break down glyphosate, and that it would only be the bacteria that can do that. However, there was recently a study published on mice looking at the effect of glyphosate and whether the mouse was able to break that down in vivo or in its own body, so to speak. And so in this study, what they did was they injected really high levels of glyphosate. They injected really high levels of glyphosate into the peritoneum. And what they found was that there was a significant elevation of AMPA and glyoxylate in the liver of these mice. They found that this could go on to cause metabolic dysfunction related to the deposition of liver fat and elevated triglycerides and attacking certain proteins and whatnot. The key point here is that what this study suggests is that the mammalian body does have some degree of ability to break down glyphosate. Now, they're not sure which enzymes are involved, and it is also a possibility that actually the bacteria may be playing a role here, and that it could be microorganisms, probiotics, it could be bacteria in the gut or elsewhere, which do this for us. But what we know is that when we have a high intake of glyphosate, this is potentially going to be converted into glyoxylate and AMPA in the liver. Now, one limitation of this study is that these used extremely high doses of glyphosate, and that is something that we would never come into contact with naturally. However, it does point to this idea that we can in some way metabolize glyphosate in the body. Now, if you remember from previous videos I've done, in the context of oxalates, this is where it gets quite interesting, because the byproduct of glyphosate glyoxylate, one of those byproducts is glyoxylate. And glyoxylate is a key product of the glyoxylate pathway. As you can see from the diagram, glyoxylate can be converted into oxalate via an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase. Glyoxylate can also be neutralized or converted into glycine via the action of an enzyme called alanine glyoxylate aminotransferase, and that is vitamin B6 dependent. There is also another route for glyoxylate which isn't shown on this diagram, and that involves vitamin B1 as well. So if you have high levels of glyoxylate, you can do something with that. You can kind of neutralize that to some extent, theoretically at least, by using B6 and B1. However, in the context of a B6 deficiency, in the context of a B1 deficiency, or in the context of just very high levels of glyoxylate to start with, and that could be coming from many different places, it could be coming from methyl glyoxyl as well, then we see that there is a possibility that the glyoxylate coming from glyphosate could potentially be rerouted towards oxalate synthesis. And interestingly enough, oxalate actually inhibits the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase. Now, it's therefore possible that glyoxylate could be converting into oxalate, but then there could also be a backup of glyoxylate, which is what Dr. Stephanie Seneff has spoken about. And we know that both oxalate and glyoxylate are toxic to human cells. Glyoxylate is a potent glycating agent, which means that it can kind of irreversibly modify proteins and prevent them from working properly. And so is it therefore possible that a high intake of glyphosate rendering glyoxylate can go on to make oxalate in the liver? Well, that is possible. It's also possible that higher intake of glyphosate may tax vitamin B6, because each time you're converting glyoxylate to glycine, you are using B6. So it's possible that glyphosate could increase the requirement for B6. It may increase the requirement for B1. This is purely speculation at the moment because I can't see any research on this topic. But the point is that glyphosate may be one of those other underlying factors which are involved in the endogenous synthesis of oxalates in the liver. Now, some of the risk factors for elevated intake of glyphosate, this is going to be highly individual. However, some things which I look for in clinical practice is if someone lives close to agricultural land where there is spraying or farming, someone knows that they're growing either GM crops, or if there's wheat or corn or anything like that in the close vicinity, there's a good chance that the glyphosate that they do spray is in the water supply. It may be in the air that you're breathing. It could make its way into your house quite easily. So these are major risk factors. Another one is a dysbiosis in the gut. So if we do not have certain microbes which can degrade glyphosate, then it is therefore possible that we are potentially going to be absorbing more of that. And it's again theoretically possible that more glyphosate could render more glyoxylate, which could then go on to produce more oxalate. A conventional diet, a non-organic diet, even if you're on a carnivore diet, this is one of the key reasons why I generally recommend people to try to source grass-fed, non-GMO grain-fed animals, because there is that possibility for accumulation. And there is also the issue which Dr. Stephanie Seneff has also pointed toward, is that they may have been using oxalic acid as an additive to Roundup, or as an additive to other glyphosate based products, to increase the toxicity of glyphosate. So this is certainly a concern because it may not only be the glyphosate which can turn to oxalate in the body, but it may be that anything containing glyphosate is also containing oxalate to begin with. And so there are a couple ways that you can test for this. This is fairly new on the market, but one of those tests is the urinary glyphosate test by Great Plains Laboratory in the United States. Now, this is a simple test where you just wee into a urine pot, you send it off, and then within a couple of weeks you have your sample back. Another test that I have been using recently is actually the Kudzu Science lab, which is based in France, and this is a hair test. And so I was looking at some of the research. Urinary glyphosate is quite a good marker for recent exposure, whereas the hair test seems to be more accurate for long-term exposures. And the good thing about this one is that it not only tests glyphosate, it also tests its byproduct, AMPA. Furthermore, it also tests for another pesticide, which is a glutamate analog, and this is called glufosinate. For the audience who want to learn more about the topic of glyphosate, its potential toxicity, maybe the relationship with oxalate and sulfation and other kind of diseases, then in fact I would recommend that you read any of the papers published by Dr. Stephanie Seneff and Dr. Anthony Samsel. They've got several different papers on this, and I really highly recommend that because unfortunately I don't have the time to go through all of the details in one video. So if you like this video or you found it helpful, please like and subscribe to my page, EO Nutrition on Facebook, and my website is www.eonutrition.co.uk. Thanks, and I will see you next time.